All right, good evening, everybody. My name is Heather O'Bara, and I'm the Community Outreach Coordinator for Alachua Conservation Trust. And I'd like to welcome you this evening to our author talk with Rick Kilby. The title of tonight's talk is Heal Florida's Waters, Lessons from Florida's Spa Era. So before we get started and before I introduce Rick, I would just like to give everybody a little bit more information about Alachua Conservation Trust since we are hosting this evening's webinar. For those of you who are new to ACT, we are an accredited nonprofit land trust, and our mission is to protect the natural, scenic, historic, and recreational resources in and around North Central Florida. And we do that through acquisition, donation, and conservation easements in 16 different counties in the North Central Florida area. Tonight's presentation is part of ACT's Keep Florida Wild virtual series. If you'd like to support future environmental education programming like tonight's talk, a donation can be made by texting Florida Wild to 44321. And we greatly appreciate your support. I will put that information in the chat if you'd like to make a donation towards educational programming like this. In addition, a recording of this evening's talk will be available online on YouTube right after the talk ends. So if you know someone who wasn't able to make it this evening, they're more than welcome to watch it on YouTube later on, or if they weren't able to get into the webinar tonight, we are broadcasting live on YouTube so they can watch it right now via our YouTube channel. And for those of you who are watching on YouTube this evening, please feel free to put your questions into the chat. I will be monitoring that chat as well. And to that effect, we will be having a Q&A after Rick's presentation. And so if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. You can also use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We cannot put anyone's microphones on. So if you raise your hand, I'm not able to turn your mic or camera on via the Zoom webinar feature. So please feel free to use the chat and the Q&A box, and we'll be able to hopefully get to your questions by the end of this evening. And with that, I'd like to introduce Rick and then turn it over to him to give his presentation this evening. So Rick Kilby grew up in Gainesville, Florida, looking for shark's teeth, swimming in springs, and wading through swamps. A University of Florida graduate, he has earned his living as a graphic designer since 1986 and has been self-employed for over 20 years. Inspired by a trip to the Fountain of Youth in St. Augustine, he created a blog about the history and culture of Florida in 2008. His Old Florida blog now has almost 900,000 views, and his Old Florida Facebook page is followed by over 58,000 people. He has delivered papers at several conferences of the Society for Commercial Archaeology and is the designer and managing editor of Reflections from Central Florida magazine, the journal of the Historical Society of Central Florida. His first book, Finding the Fountain of Youth, was published in 2013 and won a Florida Book Award in the Visual Arts category. His second book, which we'll be talking about this evening a little bit, Florida's Healing Waters, was published last fall by the University Press of Florida. Rick's mission is to motivate other Floridians to appreciate and preserve the natural and historic wonders of their state. So I'm very excited to have Rick. I've known Rick for a very long time, so to have him present here is a real treat for me and hopefully for all of you. So Rick, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Heather. I'm going to start sharing my screen right now. And I want to thank the Alachua Conservation Trust for having me here. And I also want to thank the Alachua Conservation Trust for supporting the Springs Eternal Project, which is the advocacy group that I'm in with Leslie Gamble and John Moran, where we work for the preservation of Florida Springs. And ACT has been a big part of that support for a number of years. This talk is a little bit different than the one I did for the Matheson last month, if you saw that. So hopefully you will, if you tuned in for that, you'll hear different content. I'd like to start here, though, at White Sulphur Springs. This is a postcard that was in my first book, Finding the Fountain of Youth, because this has really launched me in the curiosity about Florida's healing waters. When I saw this postcard, I wanted to understand who were all these people? Why were they here? Where did they come from? And if they were invalids, how come they weren't social distancing? Actually, I didn't worry about that until later, much later than I started working on the project. What I did do is I found 22 spring-based spas that were in Florida. There may be more than that, but I really focused on the ones that were heavily promoted, where it was easiest to do the research, and the ones that had really interesting stories. So I had to kind of classify them in different groups. So the ones in orange are the ones that are all along the St. Johns River and in the St. Johns River Basin, or a valley, I should say. And Altamonte Springs is kind of outside of the St. Johns River, but it was important to add that as well. The ones in blue are the ones that I consider to be in North Florida, and those were reliant on railroads, whereas the ones on the St. Johns were mostly reliant on steamboat travel up and down the St. Johns River. And then the ones in green are the ones along the Gulf of Mexico. And there was such a range in those. Some early on, you got there by horseback and you just camped in a tent while you were there. And others were full on sanitariums like Espiritu Santo Springs and Safety Harbor. Perhaps the most popular spa of that era was Green Cove Springs, which is a small third magnitude sulfur springs. And it was really popular because of its proximity to Jacksonville, the popularity of steamboat travel up and down the St. Johns, and the growth of Florida as a state as a haven for invalids. And it prospered towards the end of the 19th century. It was nicknamed in Saratoga of the South, drawing on the reputation of Saratoga Springs, New York, which was the premier watering place for the wealthy elite in the United States during that time. From the 1870s after the Civil War through the 1890s, Green Cove Springs expanded at a meteoric rate, catering to northern visitors who flocked to the little spring. And you can see the little spring is there in a circle, and the whole town and all those steamboats and sailboats along the river are there because of the healing waters, because people came there to take the waters. And when I say taking the waters, what I mean is this is the common term for therapeutic treatments that Gilded Age visitors practice at these mineral springs around the state, where they bathed in and they drank copious amounts of the mineral water. There was a whole regimen where you started in the morning drinking the mineral water, and then you bathed at a certain time, and then you drank more water, and you might get back in the spring a second time, but usually there was only one bathing period. The people came to Florida in order to water for both invalids and tourists. I think in the beginning of the 19th century, there were more invalids than tourists. And as we get closer to the dawn of the 20th century, there were less invalids and more just tourists. But they all went to these watering places because that's what society did at that time. And the best hotel to stay at Green Cove Springs was the Clarendon. It was a super fancy hotel that had luxuries like spring beds, hair mattresses, electric bells, and a bowling alley and a billiard room. And they also owned the rights of the spring, so they fenced it off, and you could only bathe there if you were a guest of the hotel or you paid to go in. And then they also piped in the hot and cold sulfur water directly into the hotel, so you could bathe within the hotel without going out to the spring. They were people of means coming at that time, so they needed a variety of entertainment options, so they could do a huge amount of activities from dances, concerts, croquet, horse racing was very popular. Shopping was very popular. You can see this is an ice cream parlor in the upper left. Hunting and fishing were extremely popular in that era. In fact, at one point, they worried about the amount of alligators left on the St. Johns because they were just killing so many of them randomly for no reason. And boat rides were very popular too. And you could always catch a launch outside the hotel. Magnolia Springs also had, which was maybe just less than a mile up the river from Green Cove Springs, had a golf course as well. And my favorite story about that is there was a significant amount of Civil War activity in the area. So they dug trenches for strategic war use during the war. After the war was over, they just made those into bunkers for the golf course. And it was one of the few places, St. Augustine had a golf course, but one of the few spas that had a golf course during that era. But these were leisure activities for the wealthy who were coming here in winter. And most of the people coming then were entering from Jacksonville. Jacksonville was very convenient for a number of reasons. There was steamship connections to New York and Charleston and Savannah. And as early as 1865, Jacksonville boosters were writing promotional articles that called Jacksonville the Italy of America. Nobody would call it that now, but it was known as the Italy of America. Plus, there was a number of Union soldiers who were stationed in the Jacksonville area during the Civil War, and they went back up north after the war, and they talked about how the winters were so wonderful and warm. So before you know it, Jacksonville boomed, and it really benefited from being on the St. Johns River because it made this St. Johns River was like I-95 or I-4 or I-75. It was the main artery through North and South Florida. And people would transfer from the steamers and sailboats when they got to Jacksonville and get on smaller riverboats. And that's what brought them to the springs. So the springs along the St. Johns had a huge benefit, and they developed a little bit earlier. In the interior of the state, however, tourists were delivered by railroads. By 1861, they had completed a railroad to Live Oak, allowing visitors to get there from both the east and the west. And they had planned this remarkable hotel that you see in the picture, but the Civil War happened and it was not created until 1883. So about 18 years after the end of the Civil War. But they call this an elegant hostelry, I can't say that word, with 120 rooms. And you can see the railroad depot on the right that allowed it to really prosper as one of the premier resorts of that era. They advertised that they had a perfect system of hot and cold sulfur baths. So they piped the water from the spring that you see here into the hotel, like Green Cove Springs. And like so many of those spas, they listed a long laundry list of things that the water would cure: rheumatism, dyspepsia, another one of those words I can't pronounce, which basically means indigestion, female troubles, eczema, and all blood afflictions. And you've probably, if you've been to the Suwannee River, you may have seen the rock wall that still exists today. It's rare to find pictures of the bathhouse facilities that were built atop the rock walls. This is only one of two pictures that I've been able to find. Florida's spa era extended into the beginning of the age of the automobile as well. Cars allowed for a few of the properties to become more accessible, but the freedom of automobile traffic also allowed visitors to choose other watery destinations like the beach, which eventually exceeded the popularity of spas located at the springs, and people stopped going to the spas and started going to the resorts and beaches. There are still a handful of places that still cater to tourists who are looking for healing and restoration at springs. The Safety Harbor Spa and Resort near Clearwater operates as a full functioning spa a century and a half after Soldier Station in Tampa during the Second Seminole War discovered its healing waters. And that's what it looks like. That's where you bathe today. It looks like a swimming pool, but there are 5 springs there, and one of the springs is piped right into the swimming pool. Warm Mineral Springs in Sarasota County has a devoted following of mostly Eastern Europeans and Russians, many of whom moved to Florida in order to take the waters on a daily basis. I don't have a photo credit on this picture, but it's another one of John Moran's, and I want to give him a shout out and thank him for letting me use his images in my talk, and you'll see a bunch more. And I highly suggest a trip to Northport, Florida to see Warm Mineral Springs. There's nothing else like it in Florida. There are remnants of the physical structures built for Gilded Age visitors. Vestiges of this important era still remain if you know where to find them. And these are a few that I've made my own pilgrimages to. Back in the days before COVID, right now, I would ask you a question. Who's been to these places? So thanks to modern technology and Heather's help, hopefully we can do a poll and I can see if you guys are spa hunters. So if you're on Zoom, I don't think you can do this on YouTube. You can see a poll in front of you. And the question is, which of these former spa locations at Springs have you visited? Green Cove Springs, White Springs, Suwannee Springs, all of the above, or none of the above? And I can see the totals coming in. This is really cool. It looks like a lot of you have been to White Springs because it's not that far from Gainesville. Fewer have been to Green Cove Springs, and fewer still have been to Suwannee Springs. All of the above, a few have been, and none of you, well, 40% have been to none of them. So I recommend checking them out because they are important historical relics from the past, from this era of Florida history. All right, let's go ahead and take it off now, Heather. Much of the research from my book came from a vast array of accounts of travel logs or travel books that were written in 19th century about Florida in the 19th century. Anyways, there was a huge amount of literature, travel literature written about Florida in the 19th century. And that's one thing that created the boom in people of invalids and tourists and settlers coming to Florida. There was also magazines like Harper's and Frank Leslie's illustrated magazine that people knew about Florida. There was a lot of publicity. And one of the things I learned when I was doing the research is I found this book called The Florida Reader that was published probably in the 90s, I believe, by a couple of Rollins College professors. And it's full of literary accounts of Florida going back to the 1600s or the 1500s. And they claim that Florida has the longest literary tradition in North America. But they also have a very interesting theory that I think was very useful to me, and I'm going to talk about it tonight. They say that all those accounts that they collected in their book falls in one of two categories, and they're both from the story of the Garden of Eden in the book of Genesis in the Bible. The first one sees Florida as a paradise. And it says, this is a place where man surrenders to nature and is restored and renewed without significant effort. It is a land of milk and honey. And this point of view represents a connection to nature and can be seen in romantic prose of novelists who visited the state and the writings of energized environmentalists. It's a narrative of unity and connection to nature. So one of the pictures I think that illustrates this best is that here is a Seminole woman, and she's making flour from kuntis. I think many of us probably have kuntis in our yard. It's a native plant that's used for landscaping purposes, but the native people who lived in Florida used it to make flour. Whereas when the Europeans came to Florida, they planted stuff like indigo, which were non-native plants, and used enslaved labor to do them because they had a whole different mindset. And that second mindset is what I'm going to talk about next. But this idea of Florida as a paradise, as a Garden of Eden, is found in many examples of publications and propaganda that the state put out. This is, again, an image from my first book. It's one of my favorite images because it shows how they like to portray Florida as this incredible earthly paradise. And they still put that message out today. This is a screenshot from Visit Florida. What you don't see in this picture are any roller coasters. You don't see any attractions. You don't see any traffic jams on Archer Road. This is the vision that they want to portray of Florida. Florida is paradise. And look at all the images with water. This is what the state continues to put out there today. So you have the one Garden of Eden story as Florida's a land of paradise. The other is a land of potential. And that goes back to a second narrative from Genesis that requires man to act upon nature and establish a state of harmony, not only with the land, but with himself. So this is a perspective of man taking dominion over nature. And to me, that's represented in this picture. This is Pedro Menendez, the founder of St. Augustine in 1565. He's the guy with the puffy pants. And he's saying, I want to put the visitor center right across from the fort near Ripley's Believe It or Not. And so it happened. This is an image to me that represents transforming nature to suit the needs of man. Nature is something to be conquered and civilized for man's use. And that came to Florida when people of European descent got here in 1513 with Ponce de Leon, and later in 1565 in St. Augustine. Both the narrative traditions represent two completely different worldviews, and both have been present in the state since the arrival of the Europeans. Here are two publications that came out at the same time period, roughly. On the left, you have Alachua County, the Eden of the South. And if you read this book, it's really funny because it talks about the wonderful breezes that come through Gainesville from both the Gulf and the Atlantic. And I had lived in Gainesville for 22 years, and I don't remember feeling any sea breezes there. But on the right is a publication put out by Seth French, who was the state's first commissioner of the Bureau of Immigration. His job was to get people to move to Florida. And he talks about Florida in terms of its climate, soil, and productions, in terms of the natural resources that can be exploited in order to have dominion over nature. So which one is it? Is Florida a paradise, or is it a place that needs tending by man? I would submit that above the surface, the state has been promoted as a paradise, but in reality, our natural resources have been commodified for a very long time. And those results of the results of that commodification are not good. In order to restore our waters back to their natural state, we need to shift back to the notion that Florida is a paradise and we are living in harmony with nature. The story of the commodification of Florida is reflected in the story of Florida's healing waters. Time for poll number 2. What is your perception of Florida? A, is it paradise? Is it a Garden of Eden? B, is it a place that you can exert dominion over? Is it a place of potential that we should suit to fit our needs? C, is it both? Or D, is it neither? Do you think that formula doesn't actually accurately represent the narratives that are out there of Florida. So I see the results coming in there. No one has said that it's a place where we should exert dominion over. So I think I'm getting a sense of the audience. 33% says it's paradise, but a large segment of you think it's neither, which is very interesting. And I hope we can have conversation about that at the end of the talk. For me, I see both points of view, because when I work in my backyard, there's a side of me that wants to kind of create my own paradise back there, but there's also a side of me that feels like this is I need to make this native habitat for all the animals that I want to use it. So I'm going to stop sharing this and hopefully it'll go away. Thank you for participating in the poll. Let's take a look through history to see how those two kind of paradigms came to Florida. This is a quote from a friar who was here during the Spanish period, and he said, the indigenous people, they didn't sow and they didn't work because there was a perception that they just were living in paradise and they didn't need to do any work because they were just living on the land. And we know that's not an accurate perception, because we know that they actually changed the land. And this is an image that I took at the Matheson Museum at the exhibit they had a few years ago on the St. Johns River, that shows this large amphitheater that's said to be the largest amphitheater of that kind in the entire Southeast, that was made over hundreds of years of accumulated shell by indigenous people. And it showed their relationship to the springs. It wasn't just that they went there to hunt fish, they saw the springs as sacred places. We know that ancient people had a deep spiritual relationship with water. The late writer Bill Belleville writes that the Timucuan word for all forms of water was ibi, and that the Timucua believed springs to be holy ground and only the sick could reside there. The Timucua understood their place in nature, their unity with nature, and their spirituality reflected that. This is consistent with ancient indigenous cultures across the globe who found springs and water itself to be sources of spirituality. Sacred waters are prevalent in almost all culture in the world, and deities often associated with the springs were found in the water. Powerful gods and goddesses resided in sacred waters and imbued it with healing qualities. The concept of spirituality connected to water is found throughout human history. To get a better understanding of that, I visited places like the Roman Baths in Bath, England, to get a sense of what it would be like to bathe in what are essentially holy waters to different cultures. And there's so much history there. The bathing tradition that now exists in Florida and came here in the 19th century, really, Bath, England is kind of ground zero for that, because it was a place where the Edwardian tourists came, is the place where the Romans bathed, and the people before that bathed there in the sacred mineral waters. And if you want to take the waters there today, they have a facility for that, and it's right by the ancient Roman baths. And this is what it looks like. It's this cool rooftop place. It looks like a pool, but nobody's swimming. Everybody's just kind of floating around because you're bathing. You're not swimming, and there is a difference. Although they do give you those pool noodles like they have in Florida pools. And there's 3 or 4 stories of different therapeutic treatments. And it's kind of new agey, but it's kind of like a water park in a way, but it's incredible. I highly recommend a trip. The literary tradition has examples of spirituality and healing connected to the water. The Christian Bible is full of stories of sacred water, including the story of the pool of Bethesda, where healing could be found in an angel that troubled the waters. So when the water was troubled, the people sitting around would go in and they would be healed. And to me, this image looks so much like a spring boil that I think it's probably was at least the inspiration for this painting. And that tradition endures. This is a picture that John took of a baptism on the Ichitucknee. And there's still people who connect to that sacred tradition of water. But then there was a shift. As we're going forward in time, there was a shift. As Western civilization emerged from the Middle Ages, the widespread belief in the sacredness of water diminished as a more modern perspective emerged. In the era of Enlightenment, scientific reason became a new lens through which to see the world, and the source of the magic of healing waters was no longer seen as divine. Philosophers and science believed that the mysteries of nature could be unlocked if we carefully observed and studied. Water's healing powers were attributed to the chemical composition, especially the minerals dissolved in it. Science removed the magic from the waters. And I think this is where you see the shift from paradise to taking dominion over nature. But the bathing tradition was almost entirely lost in the Middle Ages. Afterwards, in the era of Enlightenment, the Age of Enlightenment, a different kind of spa culture arose out of the ashes of that. And a lot of the places they found were ancient Roman baths in places like Spa, Belgium. And this new bathing tradition emerged, and people of means started to gather at the watering places of Europe, like Spa, Belgium, like Paris, France, like any place named Baden in Germany is a word for bath. And eventually this new bathing tradition would make its way across the pond to North America. So again, I decided I have to do my research and go to some of these places to kind of understand what it is we were connected to here in Florida. The other reason was this book took many years to create, and there were times where I would be kind of bogged down and need inspiration. And to me, going to these places, I'm kind of a spa junkie, or taking the waters junkie, and would inspire me to keep going and writing over the course of 5 or 6 or 7 years, however long I was working on this book, I needed these trips. And maybe it speaks to the healing powers of the waters. This is Warm Springs, Virginia. And this is the place where Thomas Jefferson spent 9 days taking the waters. And this is the same bathhouse. I took the waters in the very same bathhouse. Sadly, it's closed. It's in a bad state. Hopefully historic preservationists will find a way to preserve it, because it is a very, very important site in my estimation. No place is exactly like this in Florida, however. The big shift, in my opinion, in Florida occurred when the British came to Florida. The Spanish were here first, and they used the state basically as a tactical possession to protect their resources in other parts of the world. But the British encouraged settlement, and they encouraged their settlers to take dominion over their new property. And they established a plantation economy up and down the St. Johns River with an enslaved workforce. But for my proposition, I think the most interesting thing that happened during the British period was the arrival of the Bartrams. And John Bartram was King George of England's royal botanist in the colonies. And when England acquired Florida for about 20 years in the 1760s and 1770s, he had John Bartram go to Florida and the Carolinas and Georgia and stuff like that, and check out. That was the age where they were really into studying plants and nature and things like that. So he sent John Bartram to go. And so John brought his son Billy, or William Bartram as we know now. And they went up and down the St. Johns River, and eventually they went to Paints Prairie, and they met with the Seminoles, and they had great adventures. And both men published books. William came back a second time in 1774 to write his book, but the accounts that they wrote are so vastly different. I think they exemplify those 2 points of view between paradise and the communion with nature. So William Bartram writes about the pendant golden oranges dancing on the surface of the pellucid waters. The bombing air vibrates the melody of the merry birds, tenants of the encircling air motive growth. He's writing poetry, and his words had a profound effect on the Romantic poets back in England. Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Tennyson were all influenced by Bartram's writings. But senior Bartram, John Bartram, writes this about Satsuma Springs on the St. Johns River. It was a big fountain, big enough to turn a mill of warm, clear water, a very offensive taste, and it smelled like bilge water, outwashings of a gun barrel. It's so ironic that he would complain about the smell, because 100 years later, that's what they look for when they created a spa. But for some reason, John Bartram just didn't see it. He exemplified that dominion aspect, where I think William Bartram exemplifies the communion with nature, the unity with nature point of view. So where John Bartram talked about, this spring is big enough to turn a mill wheel, there were actually several springs where there were mill wheels. And the most popular, most famous is, of course, probably the reproduction that they have at De Leon Springs in Volusia County. But there were other mills that had mill wheels, or other springs that had mill wheels in North Florida as well. Up until recently, this mill wheel represented pancakes to me. If you've ever been to De Leon Springs, you can go to the old Spanish mill, and you can make your own pancakes on the grill. But recently, a few weeks ago, I went to this new exhibit that's up at the little museum in Enterprise called Slavery and the Struggle for Freedom in East Florida. It's an exhibit about slavery, Indian removal, and resistance in Volusia County, mostly at Spring Garden Plantation, what is today De Leon Springs State Park. This whole exhibit was created by incarcerated researchers, and it's about the forced enslavement of Africans during the British period. And to me, this whole idea of using enslaved labor is another example of this whole dominion over nature point of view, because if you can control people and make them your slaves, of course you can have control over nature. And it's a whole new aspect of history about our springs that's starting to be revealed. And there are other places where springs were there. There were plantations at springs and enslaved labor was used. And it's just a different way of looking at it. Of course, spring water was potable, and the land around it appealed to early settlers who needed an abundant supply of water. Also, a big part of taking the waters was drinking the mineral water. And this is where this bottling water, I don't know if you want to call it a tradition, we still do it today. It emerged from taking the waters. It's really an offshoot of that. So on the left hand, it's one of my favorite pictures. The ladies are dipping what's called the demijohn into the spring to get spring waters to drink. And then doing the same thing on the right at the small spring at Manatee Mineral Springs, which has a remarkable history. The crystal clear waters, especially those with obvious mineral content, were bottled at many Florida springs and spas. So this is a publication from 1999 showing several springs where water was bottled. Some I'm really familiar with, some had spas, and some I've never heard of. Cedar Spring, this Dishong Spring, I don't know, I've never heard of, but at some point they may have just been artesian wells where they called it a spring and they, dug a well and they bottled the water. One of the most famous brands, though, was Orange City Mineral Water. It was found to be 99.9% pure. It sounds like an advertisement. In 1904, the bottled water earned the highest award that the world can give at the St. Louis World's Fair. And their slogan was, "Be safe, protect your health, drink Orange City daily." The legend is that John D. Rockefeller loved the water so much that wherever he traveled, he took that water with him. And he also bathed in it wherever he went. The water was initially billed as a cure for everything from kidney and bladder ailments to rheumatism and indigestion. But in 1987, the well was purchased by Orange City and was capped. So the water no longer flows there. Of course, we know that Florida, this week especially, we still bottle lots of water here. Zephyr Hills was just sold. The brand was sold recently to another company. And of course, we probably all heard what happened on the Santa Fe. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is there's a long history of bottling water in the state that goes back. And to me, there's no better example of taking dominion over nature than seeing the water from our aquifer used as something you can own and sell and make money off of. But what about this whole idea of water tourism, about taking the waters and coming to the spas of Florida? How does that fit in with my theory of dominion in the Garden of Eden? We know that the indigenous people felt, their religion was built into the water and they saw water as sacred. But what about during the spa era? So this is the cover, that publication that Seth French put out earlier. And he says mineral springs of great volume are found in every part of the state, and most of them are medicinal. He's encouraging people to come down here and establish spas. He is recruiting people to come do that. Again, the dominion aspect. Orange Spring is a spring that's featured in my book, and it has an incredible history. And I thought this would be a great kind of case study to understand the people who developed the spring and made it into a spa. It's kind of in that corner of Marion County. The Ocklawaha River is the right edge, and then the Orange Creek is there, and it's right next to Orange Creek, and on across the Orange Creek is Putnam County. So it's right in the northeast corner of Marion County. And it was a popular destination for people taking the waters before the Civil War, and afterwards it was a place of recreation and then a source of bottled water. But several significant figures in Florida history were the developers. We knew that people who spoke the Timucua tongue were present in the Ocklawaha River Basin and likely came to Orange Spring. And again, they had the term Ebi for every kind of water. And we know that the Seminole came much later after the Timucua and all those early indigenous people were gone, and that there was a big Seminole presence in that area near Ocala in Marion County. I love this article. The guy who wrote said, in a way, the Seminoles are still present. And the Seminoles are what brought people of European descent to Orange Springs in the 1840s, because they built a fort called Fort Brooks at Kenwood during the Second Seminole War. And back then, you know, all the travel was on land, was done by horseback, and there was a trail that went from Palatka to Tampa that went right through Orange Springs. And most of these roads that were built by the military started as Indian trails, because obviously you're going to take the path of least resistance. And that's what initially brought people, you know, the white man to Orange Springs, for lack of a better term. But the first people to see the potential of taking the little spring there and developing it were two significant figures. First, David Levy Yulee, who came to Florida in the 1820s. His dad was Moses Levy, and he's the guy who tried to create this utopian community in Micanopy. But David Levy Yulee became an attorney, and he was, when Florida became a state, he was one of the first two senators from the state, and he's the first American senator to have Jewish descent to serve in the U.S. Senate. He was also among the earliest builders of railroads that crossed the state in order to transport goods. In addition, he owned a plantation near Homosassa Springs that used enslaved labor. Yulee saw Orange Springs as a great crossing point where you could take steamboats from the St. John's up the Ocklawaha and then get on a train at Orange Spring and take it over to the Gulf Coast to places like Cedar Key. And he had this great plan. So he enlisted a plantation owner named John Pearson to help him out. And eventually nothing happened with this. So Yulee just sold out to Pearson. And Pearson was the man who actually platted the town of Orange Springs. He built the hotel that was really the first amenity, or the first place for people to take the waters. He built a lumber mill, a grist mill, a church, a mercantile store, and a machine shop. And Pearson has a very interesting history as well. He was drawn to Florida to become a soldier in the Seminole Wars in 1835. He got married, and then he started a plantation using enslaved help as well in Marion County. I believe it was on Orange Lake. And he was the one who started a health resort there. And he eventually was a famous Civil War soldier for Florida, and eventually perished due to his wounds. But the spa flourished before the Civil War. These are two different accounts from two different newspapers in South Carolina from 1855. One says that Orange Spring was a place of considerable notoriety as a resort for northern invalids. And the writer says there were many pale faces and emaciated bodies. So later on, there was less and less tourists, but at this time, there were mostly invalids coming to Florida and coming to these places. The other writer says the spring was 25, it was a great attraction, 25 feet in diameter and 20 feet deep, with strongly sulfurous water that was beneficial for dyspepsia, indigestion, and cutaneous diseases, which are diseases of the skins. And it just, all these people with disease of the skin going there, it seems like it must have got a little gross. There's stories in Bath, England, that the water didn't flow through very quickly, and that by the end of the day, there'd be all this gross skin stuff floating on the surface of the water. It just grosses me out. You could probably done without that story, I imagine. The Civil War, plus the emergence of the nearby Sulphur Springs as a popular destination, prevented Orange Springs from ever earning the reputation garnered by other health resorts in the St. John's, like Green Cove Springs. During the war, the town of Orange Springs became a refuge for families who were threatened by federal gunboats, and also became a manufacturing source for Confederate munitions. It was really kind of a Confederate refuge hidden in the woods. So like I said, Pearson died in the Civil War in 1864. So his widow had to sell the spring about 9 years later in order to pay back taxes. And it was bought by two other Florida pioneers, James and William Townsend. They were brothers from Georgia who settled in Lake Butler. And there's a Townsend house that's on the historic register that was owned by one of the brothers. They were in the naval stores industry, which means that they cut down trees for shipbuilding and were in the turpentine business. And they had concerns in at least 7 Florida counties. They actually owned that hunting lodge that's there on Salt Springs. And this is the house that James Townsend built at Orange Springs. By the time the railroad finally got there in 1913, the spring had become a popular site for recreational activities and really wasn't a place where invalids went anymore. By the time Townsend owned it, it's kind of had gone past the heydays of being a spa destination. And his family owned it. He died in 1944, and his family owned it until 1986. His home here was placed on the National Register in 1988. It was a bed and breakfast for a number of years. I went a few years ago. It was in bad shape. I hope it still can be maintained, because another thing I would like to speak to is, there was facilities like this, these beautiful kind of Victorian style architecture buildings all over the state at these spas, but few of them exist because they are made of wood. And you know how wood does in Florida. It either burns down or gets termites or rots. And so when they do exist, we need to make a better effort at taking care of them. At some point, a development company came in and tried to sell land around Orange Springs, and they had a big barbecue at the spring. And I love this because there's this line that says, "This is not a scheme to sell land or for any other purposes except to have a glorious time." It's like those timeshare things where you go and they're like, "Well, we're just going to show you these things and you can have fun. We're not going to try and sell you a timeshare." Sure, you're not going to try and sell us a timeshare. Most of the 20th century, the spring was used as a local swimming hole. As I said, Yulee, Pearson, and Townsend are all business people who came to Florida to find their fortunes by utilizing the abundant natural resources in the young state. And it's, they're just like any other businessmen. And, the model they followed was what other people did during that time. You took advantage of the plentiful natural resources that existed in Florida. But they also demonstrated that whole thing that, nature is here to make you rich. This is, the whole idea of dominion that still exists today. And, you can see it in developers today. Today, Orange Springs, there's a bottling plant there. And I really don't want to unload on them because they are trying, at least when I visited several years ago, trying to be very good stewards of what they own. But in 1513, they really jumped into this whole notion of the state quincentennial, and they came out with this Ponce water. And so I was all over that. And it's a remarkable little spring, but it shows kind of the progression of history. It goes from a paradise to developers taking it over and trying to make a buck off of it. And then another developer comes and tries to make a buck out of it in a different way, and then ultimately becomes a bottling plant. And it's kind of the way it goes in Florida. Another story that I want to show you was started by a company called the Altamonte Land Hotel and Navigation Company in what became Altamonte Springs. And they created this very, very important hotel right between two spring-fed lakes, Lakes Orienta and Lake Adelaide, what is now Seminole County. They couldn't rely on steamboats because they were landlocked, so it really didn't succeed until the South Florida Railroad came and had a railroad stop nearby. And they had this gazebo-like spring house. Hold on, here goes a siren went by. They had a gazebo-like spring house built on a spring on the north shore or south shore of Lake Adelaide. And then they would pipe the water back to the hotel. And you can see that tank right there on the top where the arrow is. And they advertised that the water coming from their spring was the purest spring water anywhere that flows from the ground, and proclaimed that their hotel was located at the healthiest spot in Florida. This is the kind of advertising you'd see again and again and again. So this is their little spring house. And I circle the area, what looks to me like a demijohn, where you would fill it full of spring water. Obviously you can't bathe here, but you could drink the water. It's probably a very, very small little spring right by the edge of the lake. But if people did want to bathe, they purchased a nearby spring called Shepherd Springs, which today is known as Starbuck Spring, that flows to the Wekiva River and then eventually out to the St. John's. And you can see that the water is said to be very efficacious in curing a wide range of diseases. And that spring is today on private property. This is an advertisement for the hotel that bragged of every comfort, convenience, or amusement, including excellent cuisine, the finest fishing and hunting, and an atmosphere that was social and homelike. So in 1894 and then in 1895, there was huge freezes that destroyed the citrus industry. So all the other communities in that area around Altamonte Springs were wiped out and kind of became ghost towns. But because of the success of that hotel, Altamonte Springs survived and is still a town today. And the hotel was very popular, mostly people from Boston. And, you know, that was the whole idea that this company started. They built a hotel and they sold lots to people to build little cottages where they would come in winter to get away from Boston. But the hotel was still there when it finally burned down in 1953. And when it burned down, they wanted the owner to rebuild, but he just didn't have it in him. Who knows? It could still be successful today. In the 1970s, a banking software company built its headquarters on the side of the hotel. The spring near the shore of Lake Adelaide was said to have the healthiest water anywhere. It was capped and covered by the new office complex's parking lot. One of a number of springs in the state that no longer exists. Lost springs like Altamonte Springs, Worthington Springs, White Sulphur Springs, and Kissingen Springs show the ephemeral nature of springs when our environment is treated only as a resource. You might have seen this article by Bob Knight recently, and I think this was in the Sun. If Florida is a Garden of Eden, it's been fouled by lousy gardeners. We've been poor stewards of our earthly paradise, and our state's waters have suffered greatly. This, to me, is the result of an imbalance of our attitude towards the environment, over 500 years of seeking to exert our will over nature. In order to restore the environment of the state, I suggest we need to get more people to invest in the notion that we need to be better stewards of the environment. Maybe on a deeper level, the people who came to the state looking for healing or recreation were looking for something more and they didn't know about it. Maybe they were looking for a way to reconnect with the natural world. Again, this is Orange Spring, and it's still kind of in that natural environment. It didn't have the development that some of the other spas had. But Florida developers piped and pooled our springs and generally disrespected the natural resources of the state in order to profit from it. Worthington Springs went from a trickle of water found by a couple kids near the Santa Fe River to a popular resort with multiple hotels and a concrete-sided pool to now a spring that no longer flows. Pool number three, sorry, pool, they're too close. Are you ready, Heather? Are you still awake? How do you connect to nature? Do you connect in your own home by gardening and doing yard work? By hiking, kayaking, doing boating, camping, etc. Getting out there. Do you have a spiritual practice in nature? Or maybe you practice all of the above. Maybe your spiritual practice is doing gardening. Maybe it's hiking or camping. Or do you do none of the above? Do you just stay inside and look at nature through the window or through the car windshield as you go by? So we're looking like we have a lot of outdoorsy type, only almost 60% say they like hiking, kayaking, boating. 42%, just shifted, 40% like gardening and yard work. Spiritual practice, 7%, all of the above, almost 50%. So we're a bunch of nature lovers, which is what I would expect. Very cool. So I'm kind of preaching to the choir as usual. The springs that continue to flow today are plagued by reduced flow and an overabundance of nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus that results in images like this that you will never see on the Visit Florida website. This is not an image of paradise. Restoring balance between these two narratives of Florida is essential. We need to realize that taking dominion over nature comes with responsibility to preserve it for future generations. If you use it up, what are your sons and grandkids and daughters? What are they going to have? The key is to find a middle way of fostering a deeper connection with the natural world. To ensure economic progress doesn't mean natural systems are destroyed. And for me, knowing about the history of these places helps me to become more invested. Right now, Chuck O'Neill is giving a talk on the rights of nature. So if you're here, thank you, and you're not watching that. But recently in our last election, residents of my county, Orange County, voted to amend the county charter to grant rights to the Ekanalakahatchee River and Wekiva River. The Clean Water charter amendment declared all citizens of Orange County have a right to clean water, and the county's waters have a right to exist, flow, and to be protected against pollution and to maintain a healthy ecosystem. This was the most popular item on the ballot. It passed by 89 to 11%. That is a communion with nature. And since I've been involved with Springs Advocacy, I've seen a huge spike in the awareness of the connection between development and our springs. This is an advertisement for Orange County, and we really only have Rock Springs, and I'm not even sure if Wekiva Springs is within the Orange County limits. It's two little springs over in the corner, but they keep advertising this to make the connection between what you do in your backyard and our springs. And I think people are starting to get it. Despite the popularity of those messages, though, Floridians seem to have a profound disconnect from the natural world. People still have the desire to be by water, but now they're looking to man-made solutions. So this is something called the Crystal Lagoon, an artificial antiseptic alternative to nature. This is one they were going to build out at Lake Nona here in Orange County. They've already built one, I think, somewhere near Tampa, and they're building them all over the state. It's like a lake-sized swimming pool. It's antiseptic. It allows you to enjoy nature without being in nature. Here's another modern alternative to taking the waters. We still want to connect to the waters. This is called float spa, a float spa pod. It's kind of like those sensory deprivation chambers that were really popular in the 1970s, but you float in Epsom salt. And what's ironic is Epsom is named after Epsom, England, which was a spa town where they discovered magnesium sulfate. And so there's, again, a connection to this whole taking the waters. And the list of benefits achieved by doing this float spa treatment is very similar to that long laundry list of things you would have seen at the resorts in the 19th century. They help with muscular pain, rheumatism, fatigue, headaches, injury, and stress-related injuries. Just showing, again, there's an innate eternal desire to be in or near water that we still have today. So the modalities have changed with the times, of course. One treatment that seems to be, I'm repeating myself. The continuum stretching back through human history that sees water as sacred, full of awe and wonder. Florida is very much a part of that ancient tradition. I propose that we best preserve our state's resources by reclaiming the sense of awe and wonder that were held by the ancient indigenous people who lived here, and ancient indigenous people all over the world. If we can teach people to perceive the beauty and feel the magic of the waters again, they may become advocates for its protection, because we know we can't count on Tallahassee to do it, as we saw earlier this week. This is one way to do it. You probably, if you've been around, you've seen this publication that Cynthia Barnett wrote years ago now. You can find it online. And her whole theory is, if you remember back during the 70s, we had Give a Hoot, Don't Pollute. We had the Crying Indian and all that stuff that helped really get rid of trash as pollution, that we need to have a water ethic where people treat water the same way they used to treat trash and garbage. And it's a great idea, and I hope we can establish it. The other thing is, you know, right now with COVID and everything, we can reset our economy. You know, our economy is built on the Industrial Revolution, subjugating nature through resource extraction, commercial agriculture, exploiting land. We have a chance to build back better, as someone I know would say. Here's a great example. Hopefully you've seen this brand, Yopon Brothers Holly, based out of New Smyrna Beach. Yopon Holly is a Florida native, so you don't need to fertilize it and you don't need to water it. The tea is really great. It has a pretty high level of caffeine. Yopon Holly is the only naturally caffeinated plant in North America. And the guy behind this, or the team behind this, has a vision that as citrus goes out, we need to grow more of this and get this to become a way of getting our caffeine every day, because we know that's not going to go away. So this is a great example of what we can do. And so if you see Yopon Brothers Holly tea, drink it, because they need your support. I recently became aware of this guy's work, Doug Tallamy, who writes that we can save the natural world and our sorrows because we are part of it. And it is I can't even say that, essential part of us. We need to recreate that communion with nature. And this whole idea I love is to make your backyard a national park. So that's what I'm trying to do, is bring in more native plants and get rid of those exotics and invasives. And it's a long, slow slog because a lot of my native plants have not thrived, but I'm working on it. And this is Stokes aster, one of my most successful plants. I love that thing, and it attracts a lot of pollinators. It's my sincere belief that an emotional connection with place is required, that the more we understand about the history and ecology of our sacred watery places, the more we are likely to save them. But we can help make difference by altering our behavior and changing our perspective on water. This is one of my favorite pictures. Thanks again to John Moran for lending it to me. This is my book. If you'd like to buy my book, you can get it through the University Press of Florida. They normally have some kind of discount, or you can contact me directly through my website, rickkilby.com, and I will send you an autographed copy. And if you'd like to follow me on Facebook, I try and post about these kind of topics constantly. And on Twitter, I'm at oldfla. So let me escape and stop screen sharing. And let's take some questions.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Rick, for your talk this evening. That was really enlightening. Even as somebody who's been working in springs conservation for quite a few years, it's always cool to learn something new about them. So if anybody has questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box or the Q&A. I can see both of those. And then I actually have a few questions that were submitted prior to Rick's presentation this evening. So I'm going to start with those. And then if any more come in through the chat or the Q&A, we'll move on to those as well. It's the top of the hour, so we are scheduled to go till 7:30, but we'll go for at least as long as we have questions, if we don't hit 7:30 exactly. So the first question that I want to pose to you, Rick, is what was the thing that about your journey towards learning about the healing waters that surprised you the most?
Surprised me the most. I think what I loved about it the most, and perhaps one of the surprises, was going to these places that you could still see evidence of the era. These vestiges in places like Hampton Springs, where the concrete structures will still exist. Or Panacea Springs is even a better example. Panacea Springs is right on the Gulf in the Big Bend area. And there were different springs, teeny little springs that popped up, and supposedly, this would heal rheumatism, this would heal gout, this would heal kidney problems, and the different springs had different things. And they each had different kind of little facilities, like some were covered, some had almost looked like wells. They had or an oculus or something round. And when I visited that, it reminded me a lot of the sacred places in England, the sacred wells that I had visited there. And for me, it was tangible evidence of that connection of the sacredness of water. And it's a tiny little park, and I haven't been there since that last big hurricane just wreaked havoc in the Panhandle. And I'm told it's all overgrown. And I'd love to restore it because it's an incredible facility. John has this great picture of one of the springs has a roof with 4 brick columns, and one of the brick columns has caved into the spring run, and so it's just kind of hanging there, and it needs to be restored. So, but that connection, I still feel if you are open to it, you can feel that connection through time.
Great, thank you. And we've got a question in the chat. We've got a couple coming in, so thank you so much, and we'll get to as many as we can this evening. Do you think it is still possible to undo the developmental damage of water in Florida, where we sell our water but have shortages in other water districts?
I think ultimately nature will rebound. The question is, will humans still be on the planet when nature's rebound? We're the ones who are messing things up. We're the ones with too many straws in the aquifer. When we stop sucking the water out of the aquifer, it's going to come back. When there's more flow going into the springs, part of it is we've really messed things up by paving over so much of the state and the aquifer's not getting recharged properly. But nature will ultimately rebound. The question is, will it rebound in our lifetime or our children's lifetime or our grandchildren's? You know, ultimately it will. You know, I am doubtful that the springs of my childhood I'll ever see, you know, kind of that sugar sand bottom and the healthy eelgrass at a number of the springs in the state of Florida. I don't know that I'll ever see Silver Springs looking the way it did when I was a kid. It's a great example because the flow is just not there anymore, and there's too much development. You know, the villages is right there, and I don't think I will in my lifetime, sadly.
The next question is, what is your favorite Florida spring?
I get asked that every time. Well, so I'm in Central Florida, and so I don't have, you know, unless I do a long drive, I don't have access to the pristine natural springs. But you know, I'm at heart a history geek, and De Leon Springs, that whole thing about the enslaved people, is just another layer of history that I'm learning about. And there's so much history. They pulled canoes out of the spring there that were 6,000 years old, and there, you know, there's a house right by the spring that's built on top of a shell mound. There, you know, John James Audubon stopped there. There's all these different layers. There's a water skiing elephants and all that kind of stuff. And I geek out over the history, and I have to admit, I'm kind of having a hard time coming to terms because I love getting pancakes there, and I understand it's a symbol of slavery. What they need to do, in my opinion, is find a way to honor the people that were enslaved there, those over 200 individuals who were, you know, went through that awful stuff. And I don't know that they've done that yet. And there's a real opportunity to do that. And maybe I can be a part of that. I would enjoy nothing better.
Are there any photos of the old hotel at Wekiva Springs? Any history of ginger ale springs? I've never even heard of that one. So.
Okay, so yes, there are photographs of the hotel at Wekiva Springs. It was called the Tanyawatha, and it had a big porch around it and a balcony, and wasn't particularly ornate. And I think it may have only been one story. So there are photographs of that. I don't think I have any in my book, but I may have one on my computer. And Ginger Ale Springs was owned by Beeman, Beeman chewing gum fame. He was the son of the guy who owned Beeman chewing gum. There were two Beeman mansions. There was one in downtown Orlando and one in Winter Park. And he bottled the water for a time and was going to make ginger ale. I'm not sure he ever made ginger ale, but they did sell bottled water from there. And so it's like kind of like a big cistern, and it's really got a lot of sulfur in it. You can smell it. And it's kind of weird because as you walk there, it's kind of on private property now. People leave little offerings in the trees, little dolls and angels and things. So it's kind of a mysterious place. But yeah, Beeman. And there's a great blog, if you Google it, by a guy named local historian named Jason Byrne. If you
So I'm getting a lot of questions about different springs. So I'm going to give you these. And hopefully you know a little bit of history about them. So do you know the history of Barrel Spring at Wekiwa Springs State Park?
Barrel Springs. You know, I just did a hike there on the January 1st, which was the big get out and hike day, and saw that. And I know there was a homestead there, and that may have been the one attached to the homestead. But I don't know much history about that. I'd love to learn more. I don't think it's a very big spring. I know there's Silver Springs kind of to the northwest of the main spring, and Barrel Springs is one of them. But there's a homestead there, and they utilize the water. And there's that canal that they dug that heads, I think, southeast.
And then another question about Wekiwa Springs. Have you seen Witherington Spring? And if so, what's your impression of it?
That one I've only seen in photographs. It looks really ground over. I saw that. I wasn't aware of that till the January 1st. And I kind of forgot I was going to try and hike back there. And when it's dry would be the best time. It looks a little bit larger, but the photographs I was able to find online look like the edges were completely grown over. So even if I hiked it, I might not be able to get to it. But it's definitely on my list to try and get to during the drier months.
So we've got a few more questions, but folks, please feel free to send them in because I'm seeing them. And then also, if you're watching us on YouTube this evening, you can chat us there and I can see those questions too. So I'm happy to ask any questions that you have on either platform this evening. So I'm gonna go back to some questions about your book. What surprised you most about the Gilded Age in Florida and healing waters and the concept of healing waters?
Well, I'm kind of fascinated by this whole Gilded Age because I think there's a perception of people who aren't from Florida who think that we don't have much of a history, and we have a remarkable history, but there's a lot of places that didn't make it into the 21st century because they were initially made of wood. I think one of the things that surprised me is if you know where to look, you can still find a lot of the history. You just got to get off the beaten path and try. Great example is Palaca. Palaca has a lot of really cool stuff still in existence. They have a couple of wonderful churches, board and batten Carpenter Gothic style churches that are built before the Civil War. They have that Bronson Mulholland House that has a ton of history. And, it was the spot other than Jacksonville when you were coming down to go to Silver Springs, you had to stop in Palaca and then you changed to a smaller boat. And there's other places like that. There's some great houses in San Mateo and Palaca, that were built there because Henry Flagler had a railroad stop there. So there's like little bitty places off the beaten path, especially, in North Florida, that if you know about, like Melrose, there's a whole lot of great stuff in Melrose. And my whole childhood, you just went through Melrose on the way to the beach, but there's this great history of Northerners coming there and building these wonderful houses around the lake, and some of those houses are still in existence. And that's, I think, what I really love about that era is because it's not right there on the surface. You have to kind of dig a little bit deeper to find it.
Well, I got another one that just came in. I will read this one next. I wonder if indigenous definitions of sacred are the same as those of European colonists. I believe the English etymology, you can see who sent this question.
Yes, I see who sent it.
I believe the English etymology of the word sacred means set apart, not to be touched.
Oh.
Yet the notion of separation may be part of the Western Eurocentric disconnect from nature. Maybe we need to rethink or expand our definitions of sacred. Can you comment on that, Rick?
Well, Leslie should be the one doing the talk about this. This is Leslie Gamble, who is brilliant and the person who really started the Springs Eternal project. And I think I did not know that about the roots of the word sacred, but that makes a whole lot of sense. I think it's great that maybe sacred isn't the right word, that maybe we need a word that means more hands-on, more something, I like communion, I like unity, I like anything that doesn't connote separation. And that's the big thing that maybe I didn't get across is that, on my old Florida page, I don't post alligators. I don't post things about pythons. I don't post things about sharks attacks or killer mosquitoes or anything like that, because so many people in Florida are afraid of nature. They are afraid to go outside, and they go from one air conditioned bubble to the other and don't get outside enough. And I'm on my high horse and I'm going to stop now.
The next question is, which of the sulfur springs can we still dip into? So can we go swimming at?
Well, Green Cove is probably the best example. Green Cove Springs, some places year around and it smells a little bit like sulfur when you're first there. Green Cove, the smell never goes away and it's still so stinky. And it's only open in the warmer months, so like Memorial Day to Labor Day, I think, and sometimes they extend it a little bit later. You have to watch the weather because if there's any lightning, I made several trips there when there was lightning and I didn't get a chance to go in there at all. But, you don't get to actually be in the spring. You're in a swimming pool, but it's the spring water and it's still really cold and it's still spring water. That's the first place. Ginger Ale Spring comes to mind. I don't know that any place has, Orange Spring is not open for swimming, but it has so much sulfur in it. Perhaps the most of any place I've been. I'm trying to think of others. Maybe some of the other people watching can think of others, but Green Cove is the first place that comes to my mind. And Green Cove is a very interesting little town. Now, I have a feeling it's about to explode with growth because they're building all these new roads there, but it's still very quaint.
So this is a question that's actually from me. I have two questions. So if we get another question, I'll skip mine. But so you've been running your website and your Facebook page for a long time. You've got a lot of followers, and I'm always curious, like, what are people interested in when you're talking about Florida history, and it's specifically Florida environmental history? What kind of catches their attention?
Well, a lot of it's nostalgia. It's simply nostalgia. And, so it's not environmental history, but, Cypress Garden, Six Gun Territory, the attractions and all that stuff. So Weeki Wachee does really well. And people love to see Weeki Wachee. Nobody can seem to spell it, but they have all these great memories. So it's a lot of the places that people remembered as a child. And sometimes it's just, I've done things where, it's just kind of a pastoral scene. It's a canopy road or a dirt road that could be anywhere in Florida, and it evokes all these feelings and memories for them. And it's not so much, like a close-up of a Florida native plant. It's something that they remember from their childhood and evokes a memory.
Gotcha. So another question from me. So I've worked in Springs before I moved over to Alachua Conservation Trust, and I still work in Springs a little bit as well with my outreach. And I've seen the Springs. My perspective of the Springs is very different from yours.
Yes.
In that I did not really grow up seeing them when I was a child, other than Weeki Wachee, which you had to go to. That was like a necessary pilgrimage. So Springs for me were very new in 2013. So for younger folks that are experiencing Springs for the first time as they are now, what's your message for them? Is there hope of seeing it a different way? Are they kind of stuck with the version they're seeing now? Or if we start changing the way that we're looking at our natural resources as something as a commodity and more as something that we should be supporting, do you think that younger generations either have the power to make those changes, or will actually see those changes in their lifetimes?
I think the younger generations are the only people who can make a difference, because my generation is doing a lousy job. And I do think they have the opportunity. I mean, we use less water in the state than we used to, per person. The problem is, 1,000 people a day are moving down in here, and the state keeps growing, and they keep building new things for all these people, which stretches our resources thinner and thinner. If we got to a point where we did better using less of our water resources, we did better with conservation, maybe did something different with our wastewater, maybe recycled our wastewater or used that for irrigation instead of putting perfectly good clean water on our lawns, or maybe we stopped having lawns, I do think it could change. Am I optimistic? No, but I think that younger generation who grew up with an environmental ethos that I didn't grow up with will be better stewards than the people of my generation. I think it's innate in them, and it's a given. The sad thing is, the way the Springs look now, they're not supposed to be green. They're just not. And a lot of people, younger people, don't know that. And so, that's one of the reasons I do these talks. A great example is Wakaiwa. I went there and it was like any other spring I had been. And then when I started working on my first book, I went back, and it wasn't that long a period of time between visits, and it had changed drastically, and it was just fuzzy and green and, avocado colored shag carpeting on the bottom. And it wasn't that way before. It was sand. It was all sand. So I'm optimistic they can make a difference. But my generation needs to set the table for them,
Great. Well, you're doing that right now. So
I hope. I hope.
So last question, and then we'll close it out this evening. Are there any plans for another book? And if so, what are you thinking about?
I don't know. This book was hard. It was really hard. The first book, it was very short and fun and light. And this book involved a lot more research. And I love the research, and I miss the research. It's been very hard in COVID because you can't. What I liked was like going to Lake Butler and going to the Union County Historical Society and digging through their resources, and going to Largo, Florida, and looking at their pictures. And it's like you find stuff that has never been published before, and it's like I still look on eBay every day for these pictures. So I miss that, but it's also, writing is very hard. I'm not a natural writer. It's a skill I've tried to develop, and I'm still have to work on. But there are stories out there that have a lot of interest to me. I'm very interested in the different people who lived along the St. Johns River, from the indigenous to the enslaved people. The St. Johns River was the Underground Railroad during the Civil War. These federal gunboats would be going down, so the slaves would escape, make their way to the river, get on the gunboat, and be taken back up to Jacksonville. And stories like that, I think, are very important to be heard right now. So that's kind of where my energy is right now. But I'm also maybe thinking about some other art projects too.
Thank you guys so much for being here this evening. We will have a talk in late March. We're working out the final details now. We're hoping that it will be on wildflowers, and native plants, but if not, we'll have something else we hope is great for you guys as well. And please feel free to check out Rick's website. I put the link in the chat box on both YouTube and in Zoom, so that anybody who's interested in learning more about Rick's work and seeing his book and maybe purchasing a copy, you can go to that website. So once again, thank you so much, Rick. Really appreciate your time. Great presentation, and just absolutely love learning from you. So thank you.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.